Welcome to Edge Computing, Analyst Edition. Today we have Phil Shih, Managing Director of Structure Research with us to talk about edge data centers. There's certainly been plenty of going on in the US market in terms of the edge data center investment and growth, but we wanted to look across the pond, so to speak, to Europe and see what was going on with Atlas Edge. They've been making a number of announcements recently. They are a pan-European edge data center provider, and they recently announced successful acquisition of 12 data centers from Colt DCS. And that was on the back of a large number of executive hires, including the hiring of the CEO, Giuliano Di Vitantonio, and he's formerly the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Business Segments at Digital Realty. Now, just so happens, Digital Realty also made an investment in Atlas Edge. So, given the scale of what they're working on there already with big names, Digital, Colt, Phil, what's going on in Europe that's drawing the interest of these kinds of companies, and what are some of the market trends, the market forces that make this a good time for the edge data center market in Europe?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jim. And I guess I must first commend you on your Italian pronunciation. I don't know if Jim Davis. Yeah, is Davis an Italian name, or is
there? Pretty Irish, to be frank.
Okay, but yeah, Irish. I mean, that's a good starting point actually, because I think that's kind of the start of the cloud story anyway in Europe, which is it started not even a decade ago, I guess about a decade ago, in Dublin with AWS and other clouds setting up their infrastructure there to serve essentially the United Kingdom and the rest of continental Europe from a single location. As you can imagine, that probably is not going to be a sustainable situation, and you've seen infrastructure flourish, especially public clouds, onto the continent. And so you kind of have the flat markets, the kind of the core hubs, but now you're seeing in-country infrastructure pop up in various locations across Europe, even somewhat smaller markets like, say, Greece or Austria, and just with the performance requirements, data sovereignty, I think you put that together, and it creates a situation where you're starting to need localized infrastructure in pretty much any of these kind of significantly sized companies on the continent. Let's say there are about 20, give or take. My geography is a little rusty, and so. Yeah, I think what you see with Atlas Edge is they are looking forward. They're looking at essentially the next phase of infrastructure build out, which is going to move. First you're going to cover all the countries, and then you're going to go deeper within those countries. And that's essentially, I think, what Atlas Edge is thinking, is that we're going to target that next tier, that next phase, in secondary markets in national countries. So they're going to be thinking about places like Munich in Germany, like a Berlin as well, whereas the initial build up was in Frankfurt. Maybe think about a second or third market in a country like France. And so I think that's with this acquisition of the portfolio from Colt DCS gives them a start in some locations they like, and I think the interesting thing here to note, as you alluded to in your opening comments, is that there is a strong connection here back to some of the interaction operation that Digital Realty acquired, I guess, a few years back. That team was heavily involved in building out a data center footprint across a significant number of European markets, and they have definitely looked at a lot of the edge locations and are thinking forward to how that will play out in this next phase. And so I think that they've done the research, they have knowledge of the markets, they've operated in those markets, and they are a really good fit for what Atlas is trying to accomplish.
So do you have some insight into the kind of opportunities they're going to target, or that could be in terms of what are the size of the facilities they've acquired? Do you think they'll kind of stick along with a certain segment of the market? Maybe you can offer some thoughts onto what their target is.
Yeah, no, I had a chance to speak with them earlier this week. So, and they were very helpful in giving us a sense for what their plans are. Obviously, it's a very early stage operation, but I think basically what they envision is dozens, if not say, 100 locations all around a megawatt or less. So think smaller increment, non-hyperscale increments, and that kind of was the genesis of this transaction that we're talking about today, which was, Colt DCS wants to go the other way. They want to focus on hyperscale, and so they, were willing to divest their portfolio of sub-hyperscale assets to Atlas Edge, which is not looking to play in that game. They're looking at smaller increments, and they preface that by saying, in some of these markets, they will also look to, especially with these Colt assets, they're not necessarily megawatt and below. They're actually, some of them are bigger, but they're looking to build aggregation points, I think is what they described them, within some of these markets. So you have these smaller edge increments, and then connected back to a kind of what looks like more of a traditional retail colo center, but strategically selected in terms of where it is, not just in the country or in that metro, but where in proximity to the main connectivity points in a market. So I think that, and they build on that. I think the idea is, as I mentioned, is to not just think about, the markets that need more coverage, that need more localized infrastructure. But once you get into a country, what are the other metros in that next tier that are not covered as well, as covered or doesn't have as much localized infrastructure? So I mentioned like a Munich or something like a Bordeaux. My European geography doesn't kind of roll off the tongue as fast, but just those kinds of markets, like a Lyon in France or something like that. But they will look to enter a country, try to understand where the second, third, fourth largest metro is, and build a footprint around that, and of course connect it back. And they'll also take advantage of some of their partnership with Liberty Global, I think is worth mentioning, which have a lot of assets that already basically do not need a ton of work to convert to more kind of traditional data center environment, that already have connectivity tenants, and they will try to connect that, integrate that with the footprint of data centers, and connectivity is the connective tissue, for lack of a better term, for all of this.
Yeah, you mentioned Liberty Global, which obviously had a lot of cable assets across Europe. How do you see Atlas Edge playing into or not the telco initiatives for offering edge computing at or near the cell phone towers that they own? Do you see them partnering, or do you see them as offering something distinct that won't really compete against incumbent carrier offerings?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I see is, Atlas Edge, Liberty, they're going to collaborate. I think they're going to go after things like an AWS wavelength, and then the equivalent versions of that from the other public clouds. So an offering that is strategically located, that's purpose built for smaller increments of whether it's a bit of compute or connectivity, very targeted. I think that is probably what they're thinking of right now in terms of these locations that the Liberty portfolio can bring to this partnership. So yeah, I would look for that. I think that's already started. What you're starting to see in the United States. Here in Canada, we've seen a bit of that, and I think we're probably closer to that starting to expand across Europe. And the conversation I had with them indicated that demand, they feel, perhaps is a bit ahead of what they had originally thought. And there's definitely interest for coming from different types of end users looking for that type of infrastructure. And so yeah, I think you should start to see that perhaps in 2022.
Which isn't too far away, of course. One of the other companies that they might be competing against or not, you can kind of fill me in here. One of the primary companies, initial entrance into the edge data center space, EdgeConneX. Now they had most of their initial footprint in North America, but had also reached out into Europe. How do you see things playing out with that company versus Atlas Edge?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be a little bit of overlap, but I think it'll be a little different. I think that EdgeConneX is probably because they have a decent amount of their business coming from hyperscale data centers, very large multi-megawatt, dozens of megawatt facilities. So I would say they'd probably be playing in the middle to hyper, whereas Atlas Edge, broadly speaking, would be playing in the middle down, and they would overlap in certain parts of the middle of this market, and they'll overlap in certain select markets where both have a presence. I think Munich would be an example of one of them, but I have to check on the maps for these guys. But yeah, I don't think it's I think it's a different play in some sense. In that I think that you're going to see much more distributed footprint, as I mentioned, much more smaller facilities and much more distributed for an Atlas Edge, whereas EdgeConneX I think is playing more to out in edge locations, perhaps not as dense, and playing strategically for some of these really bigger bigger deployments that are out there. They have the scale and the business model to do it. So yeah, I don't think they're going to go head on. You'll see some overlap, like in many parts of this business. But I think it is interesting, though. Maybe I think worth mentioning that you're starting to see, definitely the transaction speaks to this, that there is more separation and focus in the market these days. Hyperscale data centers is essentially emerging as a standalone category. Increasingly, most of the entrants or existing players are putting most of their energy into that. And if you're playing on the interconnection retail side, or on now the kind of more edge-ish side, that seems to be kind of where your focus is. Of course, there are exceptions, and these are not perfectly drawn lines, but worth thinking about as the industry continues to mature and we get more movement of infrastructure out to the edge. You're going to see operators make those decisions accordingly.
So any final thoughts about what we might see in the edge data center market looking into next year? I mean, certainly, again, there's been a lot of investment already. Sometimes there's been some acquisitions by private equity firms of some of these players. Do we see more of the same next year or something different?
I think next year, I think the thing to watch for, again, is, at least in the European context, is what happens with local zones and wavelength with AWS, right? I think the clues have been laid in the United States, where, I think the 6 primary regions along the coasts, and now they've got, I think, 13 or 15 local zones deployments, basically filling up all the other gaps in that map. That has not yet happened in Europe, but I think next year is as good as time as any to start seeing that happen. And so, Amazon has kind of almost taken a similar approach. I think it's 5 or 6 major regions in Europe that don't cover every country, but they're not essentially just like in the United States. They're not going to try and cover every major state. In Europe, they're not going to try to cover every major country. What they'll do is, kind of stick with what they have, unless they see, a market really take off, and then fill it with these smaller increments, these edge increments. So I think the decision they make and how they deploy will give us a really, really strong hint as to, where, usage and where demand is coming from. And then you'll start to see, that I think what's great for, if you're in the data center co-location business, is that these deployments are not going to be of the scale where they will, strongly consider doing a self-build of a data center. They're going to go to a telco data center, cable facility, or interconnection-oriented facility, some kind of edge facility, where they can, deploy something smaller and strategic and quickly, and get up and running. So yeah, because of the speed at which they can do this versus, hyperscale regions takes a long time, especially in a pandemic environment. I think what happens on that front next year is perhaps one of the most important things to follow. I know I'll be tracking it very closely.
Well, good. Certainly, we'll come back to you and see how things are going again soon in that vein. So, Phil, thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate you taking the time to talk to Edge Industry Review.
Hey, thanks for having me. Look forward to next time.